By Ken Delaney, NBC News investigative reporter for the Virginia courthouse itself. Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor, he's with me, and Caroline Pelosi, a criminal defense attorney. In order of the three of you, what do you think the trial means today, and how do you think that jury got through where they got through? They seem to have had a hard time with a lot of the documentation. Ken.
Last question first, Chris. This jury meticulously went through the evidence. And the reason we know that is you can glean some things from the verdict. One is that they did not believe Rick Gates because the conspiracy counts of bank fraud where Gates was key, they could not come to an agreement on. Secondly, the tax evasion was pretty clear. They convicted him on all 5 counts of tax evasion. On the foreign bank account charge, it's really hard to understand what they were doing there. They convicted him on only 1 of 4 potential failure to file foreign bank account reports. The evidence, I thought, was very strong there. But what's clear is they went through count by count, and they found some evidence more persuasive than some other evidence. And they did their due diligence, and they don't appear to have been affected by any of this outside noise, any of the Donald Trump comments, or any of the the previous coverage of Paul Manafort. In terms of what it means for Manafort, he's looking at 7 to 9 years in prison under the guidelines, and the judge can take into account all the charges, even the charges that he wasn't convicted of, in the sentencing. So he's looking at a hefty prison sentence and another trial in Washington where the prison term is even more. So the question now really, Chris, is does he pack it in? Does he cut a deal, or does he keep fighting? And how is he paying for this defense? This defense must be costing him enormous sums of money, particularly if he tries to appeal this conviction. So I think the next shoe to drop is looking at whether Paul Manafort decides to cut a deal with the special counsel.
Glenn, how do you see it right now?
So right now, Chris, this is kind of a lose-lose for Paul Manafort because, first of all, yeah, he was convicted of only 8 of the 18 charges. But guess what? The other 10 charges, one, the government could retry those if the government chose to. But even more importantly, as Ken mentioned, the government can use that conduct as what we call relevant conduct, and that can actually enhance his sentence. All we have to prove at a sentencing hearing regarding relevant conduct is that it's more likely than not that he committed those acts. And, the fact that he was indicted.
Is that fair, actually, to say that if someone gets a hung jury and not convicted of, that's somehow held against him, even if there's no proof that he did it?
Fair or unfair.
Aren't you innocent though proven guilty?
Those are the rules in federal court. And it's not that he would be exposed to the entire sentence that he would be exposed to if convicted of those counts. But he does get a sentencing bump if the prosecutors can prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. So, and not to mention, Chris, I have to believe that Manafort is going to be that rare defendant who's looking at a hat trick of indictments, because I have a feeling Bob Mueller, once he decides to return the conspiracy indictment, Manafort will likely be rolled into that as well.
Let me go to Caroline Pelosi on this. Caroline, your view of this case as a human thing. You look at a guy he looks kind of tough. He doesn't show much emotion. Manafort looks like he's been through a lot in his life. He's a tough guy. How much can he tough? He's 69. He's facing at least now almost a decade in prison if nothing worse happens. The judge could throw the book at him for the other charges and try to win indictments on them or win convictions on those. He got to go to Philadelphia, maybe a more liberal jury, a more tough jury. Philly's a tough town. I lived there. You never know what you're going to get in the jury, and maybe liberals. Who knows? They don't like Trump. I don't know. But I wouldn't be very happy about it if I were him. And secondly, there's apparently a hell of a lot of documentation being thrown at him in the next trial. If he skated through this baby with maybe some help on that jury, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, he may not be as lucky next time. He may face the rest of his life in prison within a month.
Absolutely, Chris. I think Paul Manafort is likely taking a long, hard look at himself in the mirror today, thinking about that decision that he made not to cooperate. Remember, Rick Gates got on that stand and said, we both had this option. I chose a different option than Manafort. So the idea being, obviously, that he refused to cooperate with prosecutors. I think to the extent that prosecutors were planning on using Rick Gates in that second trial coming up, they better rethink that. Clearly, he didn't play well to the jury. His credibility was undermined. He also, Paul Manafort, has been in pretrial incarceration prior to the next trial coming up. So he's gotten a taste of what prison life is like. If I had to guess, I'd say he's going to be cooperating sometime soon.
Yeah, by the way, I made a big mistake. I'm going to a Phillies game tomorrow night. It's D.C., the next trial, but it's equally a big city court, and it's going to be tough on him. I just remember again through Watergate, those guys did not do well going into D.C. court. Let me get back to Ken on that. You're thinking about that, Ken. The difference between a North Virginia court which is a mixed bag of somebody from the inner counties and some from the outer counties. Do you have any sense at all of that jury yet and who they are?
I think the jury pool is going to be even more predisposed to be hostile to a Republican political consultant. Chris, you're right. And also this judge. It's been very clear to us that this Manafort defense team is afraid of the D.C. judge. Judge Ellis, Judge T.S. Ellis in this case in Alexandria, was widely seen as favorable to the defense. You're not going to see that in Washington, D.C. But here's the other wild card, Chris, and I've been thinking about this through the trial, and Paul Manafort, you're right, showed no emotion as this verdict was read. Is Donald Trump going to pardon Paul Manafort? He certainly laid the groundwork. He certainly talked about how Manafort's been treated unfairly. We're going to see the spectacle of 2 trials against Manafort, tax fraud charges. Tax prosecutions are rare in this country, Chris. And if Donald Trump was willing to pardon Joe Arpaio and Dinesh D'Souza, who've been both convicted of felonies, what is he willing to do with Paul Manafort? I think that remains to be seen.
Well, Glenn, and then I want to go to Caroline and the same question. It's harder to pardon someone when you benefit from the pardon personally. It's one thing to help out Jack Johnson or somebody from yesteryear, right? Because nobody holds that as a personal deal for you. Yeah. But when you're pardoning a guy who could testify against you, everybody's going to say you're Jerry Ford at best.
Exactly. And you know what? A pardon can equal obstruction of justice. It just can. Some people say, well, he has unfettered, unlimited pardon power. Yes, he does. But that doesn't mean once he exercises it, Bob Mueller can't look at his intent in granting the pardon. For example, you pardon somebody because you think they have a just cause. They were unfairly convicted. Yeah. Great. You pardon that same person because that person's relative gave you $1 million. That's corrupt. That's
Is there
unlawful.
a limit on the limit? I didn't know there was a limit on the pardon power.
So it is an unlimited power. You can exercise it in any way you see fit. But once you do, we're not trying to limit the power, but we're looking behind it to your intent. And if your intent is corrupt, you may have the power, but it could also be used against you depending on how you exercise it.
But the person still gets pardoned.
Exactly.
Thank you. And your thoughts on that, Caroline? I don't want to leave you out of that whole question because everybody's thinking pardon when the president came out and started shouting from the aircraft today out there on the tarmac like he cares about this guy. He probably doesn't care at all about Mr. Cohen at this point, to say the least.
If you look at, again, the groundwork that Trump has laid, just for example, take the Dinesh D'Souza pardon. D'Souza didn't argue that he didn't commit the crime for which he was convicted. It was the argument was it was a vindictive prosecution, a selective prosecution on the part of the government. And that's really the idea that Trump is ginning up here in this witch hunt narrative. He's going to say, you know, of course, these had nothing to do with the Russian collusion, and therefore he was treated unfairly. So, you know, and the idea of the corrupt intent, it's the same exact idea we've been talking about with the firing of James Comey. Was that obstruction of justice? He is the president of the United States, and he has unfettered power both to pardon and to fire whom he sees fit. But the question is, what was the underlying motivation?
And he may be saving the pardons for his kids, I'm thinking. Yeah. Anyway, thank you, Ken. A bad day for all the president's men guilty today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.